Judging from its having fired of the commandant of the Coast Guard, the Trump administration apparently feels the need for reform. For why and how that might happen, we turn to former Coast Guard attorney and now a Holland and Knight partner, Sean Pribyl, who spoke earlier with Federal Drive host Tom Temin.
Just out of curiosity, what is a law firm's interest in Coast Guard reform?
Well, I would say that our general interest is monitoring developments within the broader maritime sector. I've been engaged with the maritime industry since 1994 when I went off to the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy. I sailed on ships for 8 years and then was a Coast Guard JAG myself, working both on policy as well as international law and other maritime matters. I've been working in this space in private practice since around 2016, and within our firm, I lead our Coast Guard efforts. So if it's Coast Guard related for clients, it usually crosses my desk.
Okay, so what areas of the Coast Guard in this era of international competition, rivalry, and so forth, and with an administration that's looking for regulatory reform in general, what do you think could happen for the Coast Guard?
I think what's interesting is what people may not be aware of is the multi-mission focus of the U.S. Coast Guard. So there's generally 11 missions. Some say it's more than that. But what's interesting is that it serves three functions. It's always a military service, member of the armed forces. It is always a regulator of the maritime industry. And then it also engages in maritime law enforcement. So it has unique capabilities that that Department of Defense entities don't have. They don't have the ability in Department of Defense, generally speaking, to engage in domestic law enforcement. The U.S. does, and it makes them a critical component to operations involving things like migrant interdiction and interdictions at sea of drug smugglers. That is a critical component to how the government goes about affecting its authorities at sea.
And just out of curiosity, the previous Coast Guard, Admiral Fagan, had a lot of her bandwidth occupied by issues at the Maritime Academy, the sexual abuse goings on in the Coast Guard and so forth. Do you think that took necessary attention away from those missions? Maybe something out of her control, but that seemed to what dominating her term there as commandant.
I never spoke with her directly on that, but I would have to imagine that it had to. That's the impression that I have from what's been reported in the media, as well as speaking with former colleagues and other professionals, especially here in D.C. Hard to imagine that dealing with an investigation by Congress that resulted so far in over 1 million documents of emails and correspondence that are stretching back years and years could not have been a distraction. What it takes, I myself have testified to Congress, and I know what it takes to prepare for, she had to do this multiple times. So the issue is that it must be a distraction from what she had set out to do. And if you look back to when she first assumed the role of commandant, she had set out some very optimistic and clear goals of what she wanted to accomplish. And that also included really focusing on the workforce. That I did speak with her on. I was very impressed with her vision of what she wanted to accomplish. And it was, somewhat tragic that this was entirely sidetracked by an investigation into essentially the Coast Guard itself. So I can only speak to what Congress has said, and they have that
Sure.
investigation by Congress is ongoing.
We're speaking with Sean Pribyl. He's a partner at the law firm Holland and Knight. And for the three major mission areas that may devolve into many, many different programs that the Coast Guard is involved with, does it look like it's adequately funded and staffed for carrying those out effectively?
This is probably the number one recurring theme of the Coast Guard that they've struggled with for generations, which is it has an enormous impact on matters related to maritime safety and law enforcement, but it is continually underfunded. And for generations, the mantra has been that the Coast Guard will do less with more. It was only until the past couple commandants that they tried to shift that and say that they're only going to do what Congress, funds them to do, and they need more money to do that. There have been discussions about, well, how can they get more funding? How can they make this more relevant? The Coast Guard has changed agencies several times, been part of Treasury in the past. It's been part of Department of Transportation. Now it's Department of Homeland Security. So the metrics in the performance of what the Coast Guard does is annually truly impressive. It is a recurring theme that they need more money, though.
Sure. And what other reforms, I mean, if you call that, with more money, what about their problems? And they mirror the Navy in this sense that buying new platforms and getting them built on time in sufficient quantities just eats up lots of resources. And they've had ships literally that break down, when they're brand new because the
Yes.
propulsion system fails, this kind of thing.
Yes, they have had a number of troubled instances where their shipbuilding program and the execution of those programs has been really called into question. So much so that there was discussion of whether all of the Coast Guard's shipbuilding and procurement needed to be moved to the Navy. You may see some of this language in various bills throughout the past few years. They still do have their own program, but really the icebreaker program is the one that comes to mind right now in terms of the delays and how far behind schedule they are, and this the icebreaker conversation again is a multi-decade
Sure.
conversation. It goes to polar presence and deterrence, and the U.S. is an Arctic nation. We have bases in Antarctica. I've been there, and the need for icebreakers to compete with adversaries in a shifting geopolitical climate and the Arctic in particular with increased shipping lanes, it's important. And so this has always been scrutinized. This meaning the Coast Guard's ability to procure to build their ships to stay on schedule. That
Sure.
they've had issues in the past with designs and having to essentially retrofit their cutters to counter what were flaws in the design process.
Well, maybe the Arctic will melt first before they need them. And you have written that you have three basic expectations for the Coast Guard this year under the second Trump administration. Just briefly run through what those three expectations are.
Well, I think that the main expectation is going to be how they're pulled within the direction of supporting what will be focus on immigration and deterring illegal immigration. And so you're already seeing this. You're seeing the Coast Guard is being asked to provide flights, essentially repatriation flights. There's now talk of putting migrants, whatever the term is that they're using, to repatriate back to, or at least transfer them, I should say, to Guantanamo Bay, which is not a new thing for the Coast Guard. They have in the past during these, there have been historical peaks in migrations from various Caribbean countries to the United States, and they've used Guantanamo Bay, and they still do on occasion in normal cases as a temporary holding facility
Sure.
for processing them.
Okay, so the immigration question is one expectation. Couple more now.
Yeah, so I think we've touched on agency outliers as far as expectations and what Operation Fouled Anchor has done in terms of that distraction. And the concern also with that is if you have a workforce that is dedicated to searching for and preserving and reviewing over a million or close to 2 million now probably pages of emails and documents, those people, whether they're fully dedicated to that job, if they're not, then it means that the agency itself is not performing other functions, and it is busy with marine casualties. It